non-theists believe in morality. Of course, we all believe in morality. It's whether or not there could really be something. Am I, as an atheist, entitled to talk about right and wrong as something that genuinely exists without?
They like to steal morality, don't they? Monopolize it. You're not allowed to even speak about a thing without absolutely grounding it. It sounds kind of presuppositional. One of the biggest questions we constantly run across is God necessary for morality? We hear it all the time, and there's a debate I was recommended on Twitter where someone actually says William Lane Craig lost a debate. Now, before we begin, you might go, well, William Lane Craig's usually always wrong in these debates. What goes into a debate is not always the facts. Usually it's a skill of oratory, rhetoric. Can you outwit, can you outperform your opponent? Often in debates, it's not about the facts. We see this throughout history with people who are much better at being cutthroat while their opponent may actually be dry and yet factual. Well, supposedly this debate that I'm about to review, and I've never seen it, with William Lane Craig and Shelly Kagan, Kagan or Kagan, not sure how to pronounce it, at Columbia University, actually has William Lane Craig being beaten at debate. So, let's not waste any time. We're going to go ahead and react to it now. I don't know what to expect.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Veritas Forum for inviting me, and I want to thank Bill Craig for agreeing to this discussion, this debate. The topic for tonight's debate is whether God is necessary for morality. Is God necessary for morality? I'm going to be arguing that a belief in God or the existence of God is not necessary for morality. I'm at a bit of a handicap in doing this. I spoke to one of my colleagues, another moral philosopher, gave him the topic, is God necessary for morality? And his answer was, well, of course not. Now, I don't think the issue is quite as open and shut and black and white as that, but it does suggest, it does reveal, I suppose, a common outlook among moral philosophers that I share, that people have been doing moral philosophy without appeal to God for thousands of years, at the same time that they've also been doing moral philosophy that does appeal to God. It's not at all obvious to those of us who take a secular approach to doing moral philosophy what the problem's supposed to be. So I'm going to try to anticipate what some of the difficulties that Bill Craig will be raising, and maybe that's unfair. I don't mean to be saddling him with objections that he doesn't raise, or of course maybe I will be raising objections that he will go on to raise and he'll do a better job of it. So I may not get it quite right, but what I'll try to do is sketch a little bit about where I think a plausible account of morality might be that doesn't make use of the appeal to God, and try to answer some objections that one might raise against it.
This is important for all of us that constantly deal with, you must have God. This metaphysical foundation, absolute morality is anchored in a deity in order for us to actually have any kind of some way of arguing what is right and wrong must be in a deity, some metaphysical foundation. I think that hopefully that gets addressed here.
Second preliminary remark is I'll no doubt typically slip into talking about what the atheist might say or the atheist might believe, or an atheist approach to moral philosophy. And that's a bit of a misnomer, because I'm describing a view that's completely available to theists as well. And calling it an atheist view, I simply mean it's a view that does not make use of the appeal to God. It's not theistic, it is atheistic in that sense. And it's not necessarily limited to those who deny the existence of God. Let me start by putting aside questions.
That should soften up the approach for the theist to consider.
that may be of interest to some of you, and if it does come up in the question period, I'm happy to address it at greater length. But one thing one might worry about in asking whether or not morality requires existence of God is whether people could act morally if there is no God or if they didn't believe in God, whether moral motivation or moral behavior presupposes in some way belief in a deity. I certainly hope that it's apparent to every person in this audience that the answer to that question is certainly not. That is to say, atheists, and here I do mean atheists in the more narrow sense, people who deny the existence of God, are just as capable of acting morally as anybody else. They're just as capable of acting immorally as anybody else. Theists, at any rate, don't have any kind of monopoly on moral behavior. And I'm completely confident that Bill will agree about that. It's, I think, such a non-issue that I have, as I say, I'm going to say nothing more about it. The more interesting question, there are several questions one might pursue, but the one I'll be focusing on, what I take to be perhaps the most interesting question, is whether or not we need God for there to be morality, for there to be a genuine difference between right and wrong. Here we think of God not as the motivator for moral behavior, but rather God as the source or the author or the ground of morality, its basis. Yep. And so the question I'll be focusing on is whether or not there can be a secular non-theistic basis for morality, and I believe the answer to that is yes. Now, I could get off at this point, except, of course, again, I don't think there's going to be any difference of opinion between Bill and me on the question, do non-theists believe in morality? Of course we all believe in morality. It's whether or not there could really be something. Am I, as an atheist, entitled to talk about right and wrong as something that genuinely exists without...
They like to steal morality, don't they? Monopolize it. You're not allowed to even speak about a thing without absolutely grounding it. It sounds kind of presuppositional.
Out having God. So that's the question I'm going to focus on, not whether, people talk this way, whether the atheists talk this way, but whether there's some logical difficulty about their talking that way. So what I'm going to do is very quickly sketch a outline of a view about ethics that I find congenial. It's not at all original to me. I don't in any way mean to suggest it's the only kind of outline one could accept as an atheist trying to explain what morality is all about, but it'll give you an illustration of, I think, a fairly plausible approach, or so it seems to me. And then I'll raise some deeper questions about it. So here's the basic idea. Right and wrong is a matter of whether or not your behavior hurts people or fails to help them. So, which is, wrong action is action that hurts somebody or fails to help them in the relevant circumstances. And right action is basically a matter of those behaviors that refrain from hurting people and do provide help. So once we've got this basic idea in place, it's pretty natural to see how the more familiar rules of ordinary common sense morality fall out from that. We have an explanation as to why it is that you shouldn't lie because lying hurts people, why you shouldn't commit murder, why you shouldn't rape because rape hurts the victims of rape, why you have to aid the needy, why slavery is wrong, and why you need to clothe the naked and feed the hungry. In all these ways, these behaviors are morally wrong or right because of their connection with harm and failure to help. Now, there's a lot of details that would need to get worked out. I think for tonight's purposes, they're not likely to be all that important. Let me just mention that, of course, it's important to get clear that there's a variety of ways that people can be hurt. There's not just physical harm, but there's emotional harm, and there's assaults on somebody's autonomy, and you can fail to respect them in a variety of ways. I don't think I need to pursue that, so unless it comes up, I won't say more about that. And the second point is that, of course, to say that you can't ever harm is a bit of a simplification. There are going to be cases in which one would have an adequate justification for harming somebody else. For example, in cases of self-defense against a deliberate aggressor. There's a great deal of work in contemporary moral philosophy about what these exception cases are, what are the adequate justifications for harming or failing to help. And again, although I'm happy to go there, I don't think we need to, so I won't say more about it unless it comes up.
By the way, I'm already feeling like there's this thing coming, right? I don't know if you feel this way, where if you find someone acting and behaving in this I would say probably agreed upon ethical system between Craig and this gentleman that I've never met till now here, Shelly Kagan, is if you find this in any other philosophy outside of the Abrahamic one, they'll just say, oh, well, hold on, there's natural, God has divinely instilled this into all humanity, so everyone has a bit of this morality deep inside them. And when they're not acting upon these things, they're really going against the God that is so close to each and every one of us, Acts 17. In him we move, we breathe, we have our being, this kind of universal law that God is in all humanity. And by the way, that was already something being taught by the Greeks. That quote literally comes from Greek sources. So Paul's quoting Greeks when he's talking to the Epicureans and the Stoics and stuff, even though it's not Paul, it's Acts. Anywho, that being said, they'll just try to go, oh, no, but it's our God that's doing all this universal speaking to all humanity. And I think it's unfortunate that no matter what, I think this is what I know that the last video that I did, a reaction debate-wise between William Lane Craig and Christopher Hitchens was arguing, and it didn't do as well as he could have. Let's just put it that way. But he hints at this, that no matter what, they take the credit. They take this scientific endeavor just helps our position even more. It helps prove our God is the true God even more. And morality, they do the same thing. They hijack it, and it's all theirs. And really, anything that comes good from any other culture, their gods or their teachings, is really their God all along, really helping them learn these things.
Now, that's the nutshell of the moral theory that I believe in. And clearly, I didn't say anything about God. And so it seems to me I'm entitled to say that I believe in morality, and I'm entitled to believe in morality. And the question I only want to ask at this point is, why would anybody think otherwise? Well, so here's a worry that one might have. We might ask, not do I believe in this sort of thing, but are these things really wrong on the atheist view that I've just sketched? Or is it just a matter of opinion? Now, that's tricky. Of course, we're going to be arguing about whether or not God's necessary for morality, what shape morality has, and so forth and so on. And all of that, in some sense, is just a matter of opinion. But I take it the deeper question is there a fact of the matter as to who's right? Not just as a fact of the matter as to whether or not there is a God and what that God is like. I take it there's a fact of the matter with regard to whether or not it's wrong to harm people, whether it's wrong to rape, for example. I think it's wrong to rape. I take this to not just be a matter of opinion. It's not as though if I thought otherwise, rape would be okay, or if everybody thought otherwise.
Yeah, this, you would imagine everyone would feel like this, at least in our modern context. Maybe there was some time in the past where people thought this was somehow good in a culture. I'm not sure. But I don't think since written history it's ever been an okay, acceptable thing.
Rape would be okay. Rape is wrong. Full stop. So at least if you're worried about whether there could be genuine morality, where there are facts of the matter, then on an atheist account, I'm inclined to think, well, of course there can. We might wonder what makes it wrong. And the answer is, well, it's wrong because, for example, rape is wrong because it harms the victim. Might ask instead, what do we mean in saying that it's wrong to rape? Now, this is a controversial matter, and not all moral philosophers agree about the ingredients that we need to build into the basic definition of right and wrong. But roughly, I take it that as at least a first pass, the thought is something like to believe in morality as a genuine, objective state of affairs is to believe that there are reasons to act morally, to help others and to avoid harming them, and that these reasons don't depend on the particular desires or goals you happen to have. It's not as though if you happen to care about truth, justice, and the American way, then you've got a reason to act morally. No, everybody has these reasons. These reasons are overriding, to use philosophers' jargon, they're categorical reasons. So when I say that it's an objective fact that rape is wrong, what I'm saying is there's this kind of overriding, strong, categorical reason not to harm people in this way. And that's not up to me to make it so. It's just so. Now, we might ask, is there a deeper account that can be offered about where these reasons come from, or what makes them so, or the basic rules of morality, what their ultimate foundation or basis is? And I want to say that secular atheist philosophers disagree about that point. Some are, as we might call them, non-foundationalists. They say, well, we can state the various moral rules, keep your promises, tell the truth, don't tell lies, don't hurt people, help the needy. And if we want, we can boil these rules down into a simpler set of rules. I've suggested don't harm, do help. But there may be nothing at all deeper to be said about what makes those rules what makes those rules the valid rules. It's just an objective fact about reality that there are these categorical reasons. There are reasons to behave in certain ways versus other. So that's not just a matter of opinion. There are facts about what there are reasons to do. And these may be among the reasons that there's nothing deeper to say. But there are also philosophers who believe there is something more to say. And again, unsurprisingly, different philosophers will disagree about what that deeper story looks like. Let me give a very quick sketch of one such story. I think it's not bad as far as it goes. Ultimately, I think there's even more to say, but that would take us a rather long time to say that more. So let me just give you the quick sketch. It's a version of the view that's known as contractarianism. The thought is that the moral rules are the rules that we would give to one another to govern our interactions with one another, the rules that we would agree to if we were to set about trying to settle on a bunch of rules to govern our interactions under the assumption that we were perfectly rational. Nobody wants to follow rules that people accept because of mistakes in their reasoning. So imagine us, but soup ourselves up to be reasoning perfectly rational beings would agree to various rules to govern their interactions. And the rules that they agree to are the terms of morality. Now, there's different ways of running this contractarian thought. One version of it, which I have some sympathies to, adds an extra twist. The reasoning needs to take place behind a so-called veil of ignorance. The thought is, I'm not going to know while I'm engaged in this hypothetical bargaining session what my actual position in society is. I won't be able to try to rig things in favor of white males because I won't know that I'm a white male. So I argue from behind this veil of ignorance about my actual identity. So that's the basic thought. So here we have a kind of deeper story. Where do the moral rules come from? They are the rules we would give to ourselves.
I just need to comment here, and maybe he tackles this because I've never seen this debate. That is, I love this perception he's given, because if you just go to the Bible with the rules that were given to Israel by God, using the laws and stuff, the favoritism of Israelites, yes, treat the stranger, the ger, the stranger, the sojourner and stuff, like a fellow Israelite. But really, on all accounts, you have slaves. You're able to own non-Israelite slaves. You're able to treat them differently in some respects because of owning them as chattel slaves, sex slaves, the whole nine. So there is a various degree here where you go, well, God didn't even set up those rules. You seem to be more ethically moral and interested in creating a very equal legal system than the Bible's authors or God had in mind to begin with.
To govern our behavior with one another insofar as we were perfectly rational. Does this capture a notion of objectivity for ethics? Seems to me the answer is yes. There's a fact of the matter about what it would be rational for us to agree to in terms of these rules. One might wonder, is the output of this hypothetical imaginary bargaining session, are the moral rules necessary? Maybe that's another feature we're looking for in trying to genuinely get morality as opposed to merely the illusion or appearance of morality. And the answer to that is yes, I believe they are necessary. Now, if you're a non-foundationalist, if you don't think there is a deeper story of the contractarian sort that I sketched, or some other deeper story that other moral philosophers have sketched, if you're a non-foundationalist, you might just stop it right here. You might say, to say that murder is wrong is to say that there's a categorical reason not to murder. And this isn't a contingent truth. It's a necessary truth. It's a truth that obtains, as philosophers like to put it, in all possible worlds, that murder would be wrong. If we do go the contractarian route, then we instead might put our necessity a little bit deeper. We might say something like, the moral truths are necessary, but their truth is itself explained in terms of a social contract, and that in turn is explained in terms of the fact that there are certain truths about reasoning, and these are necessary truths. It's a necessary fact that perfectly rational beings would reason about what kinds of rules they wanted to give to one another in such and such a way. So I think we can get the necessity of morality as well. Here's a rather different objection that might get raised. We have the thought that morality involves commandments. We have the thought that morality involves requirements. We talk about moral laws. So sometimes it's suggested that where there's a commandment, there's got to be a commander. Where there's a law, there's got to be a lawgiver. Where there's a requirement, there's got to be a requirer. Who plays the role of commander, lawgiver, requirer? Well, it's got to be God. And so it turns out if we're really going to have the notion not just of moral reason to behave in this way or that way, but rather moral requirements to behave in one way rather than another way, then we need to appeal to God after all, to be the lawgiver. This is an argument that's been proposed by various theistic philosophers. Indeed, this very argument's been embraced by some atheistic philosophers who said, yeah, talk of moral requirements does presuppose a lawgiver. Now that I no longer believe in God, I believe there are no moral requirements. Now, I'm not myself inclined to go that way. I'm perfectly prepared to talk about moral requirements. I think it's a completely appropriate thing to do. In fact, it would be inappropriate. It would be just simply mistaken, full stop, to give up talk about moral requirements. So the question I want to push a little bit is it really true that requirements require a requirer? That's a mouthful. And I'm inclined to believe the answer to that is actually no. Let's take an example of a requirement outside the moral domain. I suppose that when we are engaged in reasoning about belief matters, theoretical reasoning, it's a requirement of appropriate reasoning that you not contradict yourself. People sometimes talk about the law of non-contradiction. I take this to be a requirement of rationality, that you not contradict yourself. Now, should we similarly conclude that since there's a requirement, there's a law of non-contradiction, there must be a lawgiver, there must be some cosmic logician who commands us not to contradict ourselves? Doesn't seem to me to be so. I mean, I can imagine that somebody does say that, but I don't myself feel the force of thinking if there's a law of non-contradiction, that is just to say that it's a claim that it's just fundamentally irrational to contradict yourself, I don't see any reason to conclude from that there must be some cosmic logician laying down that law. As we might put it, the logic of the word requirement does not actually entail the existence of a requirer. That's at least seems to me the most natural thing to say about the law of non-contradiction. If we want, we can say, I don't think any harm in saying that reason itself requires that you not contradict yourself. And that's fine. I don't have any problem talking that way. That just, of course, doesn't, it's talking about reason in a somewhat personified fashion, but no harm done as long as we understand there doesn't actually have to be a person who laid down the law of non-contradiction. Well, similarly then, I want to say that with regard to the various moral requirements, we don't need a lawgiver for them to be genuine requirements. If we want, we can say, and in fact, it seems to be a perfectly legitimate thing to say, that reason requires that we act in accordance with reasons. It lays down these various categorical reasons not to harm people, to aid them. And so we can personify reason in that way, but all we just mean, I think, is that there are these compelling, decisive, objective, categorical reasons to behave in certain ways and not behave in other ways, or to reason in various ways. So I myself am skeptical of the claim that commandments require a commander, or requirements require a requirer, or that law requires a lawgiver. So some of you may be more sympathetic to that suggestion than I am. Indeed, some of my colleagues are more sympathetic to that suggestion than I am. It's important to bear in mind that although I have the particular views I'm laying down here, it's not as though all non-theistic philosophers think about these issues in exactly the same way. If you brought up four of us, you'd probably get four different stories about how to ground morality in a secular fashion. Some of my colleagues are more sympathetic to the thought that talk of moral requirement really does entail that there be somebody who's commanding us to behave accordingly. And then we might ask, well, if that's so, who could it be besides God? And the answer I want to give on behalf of those of you and my colleagues who are sympathetic to the suggestion, the answer should be all of us. We, the members of the moral community, are the ones who are laying down these requirements. That idea is especially, I think, a natural fit if we accept the contractarian theory that I was sketching, albeit too quickly, sketching in my earlier remarks. If we think of the rules of morality as emerging from this hypothetical session in which we ask ourselves, how shall we behave towards one another? Except we face this question hypothetically in the mode of perfect rationality. What would perfectly rational beings lay down as these rules? But these are rules that nonetheless we are giving to one another. Then when somebody, and we enter into these rules freely, because we see that it makes sense for us to reach these agreements. You can see why it would be rational for us to agree to rules requiring telling the truth, laying out, forbidding lying, forbidding murder, and so forth. Then these are rules that we give to one another. And consequently, if somebody breaks those rules, they're not upholding their part of the social contract. And as such, the rest of us who are indeed limiting our behavior in keeping with this agreement, we can appropriately and with due authority turn to the person who's acting immorally and saying, you shouldn't behave that way. You're not keeping up your end of the bargain. So if you think there needs to be somebody who's demanding of us that we act morally, the answer could be, well, there is. Each one of us is demanding of everybody else, and indeed demanding of ourselves as well, that we act morally. So if you think requirements need a requirer, the answer could be, well, here's a requirer. It's the members of the moral community. Well, obviously, there's a great deal more that needs to be said about all of these subjects, but I've used up my allotted 20 minutes. But I hope you can at least see the outlines of an approach. There are alternatives. An approach which offers us a fairly plausible, I think, account of what morality is all about, under which the rules of morality are not an illusion. They're not a mere matter of opinion. They are indeed a matter of objective fact. And consequently, I'm inclined to think that moral philosophers of an atheistic inclination are completely entitled to believe that we can have morality without God. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I may speed it up for William Lane Craig if he's not talking too fast, because we can get through his sooner, but I don't want it to be too quick.
Didn't realize it had been that many Veritas Forum events over these years. Good evening, and thank you very much. I am delighted to have the invitation from the Veritas Forum to participate in the dialogue tonight, and I want to say it's a tremendous privilege to be sharing the podium with so eminent an ethicist as Shelly Kagan. The question before us this evening is God necessary for morality? Notice what the question is not asking. We are not asking whether belief in God is necessary for morality. No one.
So Craig and him are going to agree on this point.
In tonight's discussion is arguing that in order to live a moral life, you need to believe in God. Rather, the question, as Shelley emphasized, is whether God is necessary for morality. And the answer to that question, I think, obviously depends on what you mean by morality. If by morality you mean simply a certain pattern of social behavior prevalent among human beings, then obviously this sort of behavior could still go on even if it turned out that God does not exist. God isn't necessary in order for human beings to exhibit certain patterns of social behavior, which they call acting morally. But if by morality you mean that certain things are really good or evil, that certain actions are unconditionally obligatory or impermissible, then many atheists and theists alike agree that God is indeed necessary for morality. In the absence of God, morality turns out to be just a human convention or illusion. The same patterns of social behavior might go on without God, but it would be a delusion to think that such behavior has any objective moral significance. Accordingly, I'm going to argue that God is necessary for morality in at least three distinct ways. Without God, objective moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability would not exist. Let's look at the first point. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Now, when we talk about moral values, we're talking about whether something is good or evil. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. To say, for example, that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil, even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil, even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them, so that everyone believed the Holocaust was good.
So that's an interesting point. If morality is not objective in the sense that Craig is saying here, and Nazis took over the world and everyone was persuaded somehow that the Holocaust was right and good, because it's a social contract among fellow human beings, would that make it somehow in this social contract angle rather than God, would it make it good? Because we, the people, have a social agreement on what we think is right and what we think is wrong. Very deep, very interesting path that you can go down there, and maybe we'll see some interaction with that as time goes by.
My first claim is that if there is no God, then moral values are not objective in that sense. Traditionally, objective moral values have been based in God, who is the highest good. He is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is by nature loving, generous, just, faithful, kind, and so forth. And thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist. But if God does not exist, what basis remains for objective moral values? In particular, why think that human beings would have moral worth? On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On atheism, I can't see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being or dog well-being or monkey well-being.
Oh, you can flip this so easily. I don't want to be like constantly pausing this thing, but you could flip this so easily to point out why humans treat animals like absolute shit. And Craig probably eats meat. I doubt he's a vegan. Like, there's just so many different levels that he can justify his view of ethics based on God and the Bible and all that kind of stuff. So,
on a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have similarly evolved behavior for the same reason. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on an atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." End quote. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were raised under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation of speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias toward one's own species. The objective worthlessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as a purely animal organism. But if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference? We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur. Secondly, if God does not exist, objective moral duties do not exist. Duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Now, you might think at first that the distinction between right and wrong is the same as the distinction between good and evil. But if you think about it, you can see that this is not the case. Duty has to do with moral obligation, with what I ought or ought not to do. But obviously, you're not morally obligated to do something just because it would be good for you to do it. For example, it would be good for you to become a doctor, but you're not morally obligated to become a doctor. After all, it would also be good for you to become a firefighter or a homemaker or a diplomat, but you can't do them all. So there's a difference between moral values and moral duties. Now, my claim is that if God does not exist, then it seems we have no objective moral duties. To say that we have objective moral duties is again to say that we have certain moral obligations regardless of whether we think that we do. Traditionally, our moral duties were thought to spring from God's commandments, such as the Ten Commandments. Far from being arbitrary, these commands flow necessarily from his moral nature. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression. But if there is no God, what basis remains for objective moral duties? On the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it does not rape her. For there is no moral dimension to these actions. They are neither prohibited nor obligatory. So if God does not exist, why think that we have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what imposes these moral duties upon us? Where do they come from? It's very hard to see why they would be anything more than a subjective impression ingrained into us by societal and parental conditioning. On the atheistic,
Would that minimize its value? If sincerely humans are fed up with behaviors that humans do that clearly break the autonomy of each individual, allowing them to enjoy life at peace without misery and such, does that minimize it if you can't put it into, like, let me put it another way for Craig for just a moment and the viewer. If I am truly not persuaded of a God, not because I'm antagonistic and just, I don't want there to be one, like, I really do not think there probably is a God. Like, Craig is just, he's downplaying and pooping on this whole idea that there's probably not a God. And if I'm not persuaded based on evidence, what now? I mean, does Craig not see that if you have no God to work with here, you're not persuaded of Jesus, you've studied the Bible, if there is something out there, there could be, but like, where do you go for someone like me who is not persuaded of God and you're trying to peddle this idea? I mean, does that make sense what I'm saying? Comment down below. Tell me your thoughts.
View certain actions, such as incest or rape, may not be biologically and socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development have become taboo. They go against the social contract that Shelley has imagined. But that does absolutely nothing to show that rape and incest is really wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time in the animal kingdom.
It still goes on in the human kingdom, like endlessly.
On the atheistic view, the rapist who flouts the herd morality or the social contract is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably, like the man who flouts etiquette by belching loudly at the dinner table. If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law which we must obey. It's all a matter of social convention on a par with rules of etiquette. Thirdly, if God does not exist, then there is no basis for moral accountability. Traditionally, it's been held that God holds all persons morally accountable for their actions. Despite the inequities of this life, in the end, the scales of God's justice will be balanced. And thus, the moral choices that we make in this life have an eternal significance. But if God does not exist, what basis remains for moral accountability? Even if there were objective duties and values under atheism, they seem to be irrelevant because there's no moral accountability. If life ends at the grave, then ultimately it makes no difference whether you live as a Stalin or as a Mother Teresa. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky rightly said, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. Given the finality of death, it really does not matter how you live. The state torturers in Soviet prisons understood this all too well. Richard Wurmbrand reports, the cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when man has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man. The communist torturers often said, there is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish. I have heard one torturer even say, I thank God in whom I don't believe that I have lived to this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart. He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners. Given the finality of death, it really doesn't matter how you live. So what do you say to someone who concludes that we may as well just live as we please out of pure self-interest? You might say it's in your best self-interest to adopt a moral lifestyle, but clearly that's not always true. We all know situations where self-interest runs smack dab in the face of morality. Moreover, if you're sufficiently powerful, like a Ferdinand Marcos or a Papadoc Duvalier or even a Donald Trump, then one can pretty much
Is he a prophet?
ignore the dictates of conscience and safely live in self-indulgence. Historian Stuart C. Easton sums it up well when he writes, there is no objective reason why man should be moral unless morality pays off in his social life or makes him feel good. There is no objective reason why man should do anything save for the pleasure it affords him. To believe, then, that God does not exist and that there is thus no moral accountability would be quite literally demoralizing. For then we'd have to accept that our moral choices are ultimately insignificant, since both our fate and that of the universe will be the same regardless of what we do. By demoralization, I mean a deterioration of moral motivation. It's hard to do the right thing when that means sacrificing your self-interest or to resist temptation when desire is strong. And the belief that ultimately it doesn't matter what you choose or what you do is apt to sap one's moral strength and so undermine one's moral life. As Robert Adams observes, having to regard it as very likely that the history of the universe will not be good on the whole, no matter what one does, seems apt to induce a cynical sense of futility about the moral life, undermining one's moral resolve and one's interest in moral considerations. The absence of moral accountability from the philosophy of atheism thus makes an ethic of compassion and self-sacrifice a hollow abstraction. In sum, I think it's plausible that without God, there are no objective moral values, moral duties, or moral accountability. God is therefore vitally necessary to morality. Now, as I said, this is a conclusion which is accepted by a great many atheist philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Russell, and Sartre. Though the conclusion is a painful one, these thinkers believe that honesty compels them to face it squarely. The challenge confronting the atheist philosopher, who continues to cling to objective moral values and duties after letting go of God, is, I think, threefold. First, to explain what is the basis for objective moral values on atheism. In particular, what is the basis for the intrinsic value of human beings? Second, to explain what is the source of objective moral duties on atheism. What makes certain acts obligatory or forbidden if there is no moral lawgiver to command or prohibit them? Why is it wrong to harm other members of our species, to inflict harm upon others? Thirdly, to explain how on atheism ultimate moral accountability exists, or alternatively, to explain why it is not necessary to morality. These questions must, I think, be addressed if one is to maintain that God is not necessary to morality.
Look. If that doesn't pique your interest on wanting to see what's about to happen, I don't know what will. That is halfway through this debate. This is the first round. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy these reactions and you want to see what happens next, here, subscribe, check the bell, make sure you're notified whenever I do a reaction. Give a comment on what you think just happened so far. We're going to do a whole nother video here on YouTube for the second half, diving deep into the morality issue. I hope you'll subscribe. Let me know you're in the comments. Where are you at so far in this? Is this your first time watching this debate? If you haven't watched it before, I'm glad you're here tuning in. If you have, then give me your personal insights. You've been chewing on this material for a while. Give me your thoughts. So, with that being said, subscribe, hit the bell, consider helping us out by joining the Patreon, like the video, share the video out there, and until next time, see you then.